Welcome, everybody, to this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. My name is Jeff Thomas, and we've got a special guest with us today, Cale Dowell from Arcos Global. Say hello to the people, Cale.
Howdy, everyone.
And this is a webinar that we're doing really as a follow-up. As you know, another podcast host is Jeff Rutt, who founded Hope International. Jeff and I were at a Hope International event this past weekend near Austin, and we were interviewing some of Hope's givers and thought we'd do kind of a 3 webinar follow-up around this idea that we often tease out around kingdom estate planning. And we're going to do 3 of them to kind of unpack the top 3 questions that we think generous business owners need to ask when they're doing estate planning that they are rarely asked in their estate planning process. And just to kind of cut to the chase, and you can sort of see it on the screen, the first question is, how much is enough for you? And that's the question we're going to discuss today. Cale and I are just going to kick this around, talk about some biblical principles, some stories, some frameworks. The second one is, how much is enough for the kids? Or how much you leave behind, as we sort of advertise it at the webinar. And then the third one is, what do I do with the rest? So before we kind of get into that first question of how much is enough for us, I always like to kind of go through this general framework. So, Cale, if you don't mind, let's go to the next one to show the boxes on the world's estate plan. So this is kind of what we call the world's estate plan. What we're trying to do here is just illustrate the template, quote unquote, that most people are sort of jammed into. Most generous business owners are kind of jammed into this template. Frankly, most people in America are jammed into this template, which is essentially to take your total net worth, divide by the number of kids and maybe grandkids you have, and buy insurance to pay any remaining estate tax. And as you can see from this, we just took an example of $100 million. Federal exemptions close to 30 million. You give 70 million essentially to the kids, but you want the kids to have all of it, or maybe you don't want to, but that's the template. And but there's 30 million of tax to pay, so you buy an insurance policy that pays the 30 million bucks. This is, and maybe on page 3 of the estate planning questionnaire, there's a little something about, do you want to give to charity? And maybe you give a little something. But generally, this is what happens. And the reason we're talking about this is usually what happens at Arcos, this multifamily office that we run, is we sit with these generous business owners, and this is essentially some version of this is what they've got, and they're uncomfortable with it, but they don't know what another possibility is. And so we started kind of doing this on a whiteboard, and we're just doing it in these boxes in this webinar to just kind of take you through it. Okay, let's show them what that alternative one we generally show them is. And this is kind of what we call the kingdom estate plan, okay? The title here is, the generosity focused estate plan. But let's take that same 100 million. We're trying to eliminate as much jargon as we can here, right? Just plain English. Again, the federal exemption is close to 30 million. Okay. By the way, that's the amount that can go to the kids without tax. Okay. The taxable estate is that 70 million, and then there's that previous slide showed the tax that's on there. Now in this case, let's say that you set your personal finish line at 30 million bucks, and 30 million is enough for the kids. Well, what do you do with the rest? Well, that taxable estate of 70, rather than buying insurance to pay, a 30 or $35 million estate tax, you can just give it away. Now, many different ways to do that. We're not going to get into all those details today, but suffice it to say, you could give that stuff away while you're alive and have a whole lot of fun doing it, and not have to buy an insurance policy and not have to pay the government anything. So this is just a high level. We call this the kingdom versus world estate plan. We want to let you know that the U.S. government actually has a really good tax code for generous people. It's just not many people advertise it. And again, many ways to give away that money. We're not going to get into all those structures today. We're just going to talk about this general idea and go with the first question. And I know we have a summary slide there, Cale, just to kind of show you, and again, we're not trying to prescribe this. These are questions that only God can answer for you as the owner and you guys as the stewards. But the traditional model, once again, the kids get all 100 million, the IRS gets almost 30. Insurance is super expensive, and charity gets essentially nothing, or a small tip. And then in a generosity plan, if you set a finish line for yourself and the kids at 30, again, we're not prescribing that. We're just using the federal exemption as that number. But let's say you pray and that's enough for you and the kids. IRS gets nothing, insurance company gets nothing, and charitable giving is like, 70 million bucks, and all kinds of cool ways to do that and include your family. So we just want to give you a new framework that maybe you haven't seen before. Happy to talk more about that with you. But today's conversation is really, we really have at Arcos we've sort of categorized these questions everybody asks as generous business owners. That's our niche. So, the top three questions, and this is one of them. How much is enough? And so, Cale, let's get you in here. What I know it's on the screen, but what are they actually asking when they come in and ask how much is enough?
Yeah, so I use the term on the translation, financial finish line. If you've been kind of in the, faith aligned kind of community, that's a more, let's call it a growing vernacular, is this idea of setting some sort of lifestyle cap or a financial finish line. But really, it's a component of, do we have some semblance of like enough is enough? When is enough enough? Um, as there's one famous quote, just a little bit more. That's when enough's enough. Just a little bit more. And we've all heard that, terminology, keeping up with the Joneses. And there's a great, I can't remember the name of the caricature artist, but there's a great cartoonist that, he drew a little cartoon about keeping up with the Joneses. And there's this little family sitting around a table, and they've got the spreadsheet out, and the dad's pointing at it. And he's like, all right, we caught up with the Joneses. Next up, the Nelsons. And so there's this kind of, idea in American culture, as we all know, where if we just have a little bit more, maybe then we'll either achieve some modicum of success, some modicum of significance, some sense of achievement. And as we all know, particularly anyone that's been on that journey or that path, and as we've talked with so many over the years, that's not the finish line that brings about any sort of sense of significance or ultimate purpose. So it's an important question because it's in a lot of ways it's hard to define. It's going to be very unique to individual. But on the other hand, to some degree, it's also the easiest to answer because we can apply some math to it. And we'll talk about that here more in just a little bit. But I think by way of maybe a starting place, we like to begin as we have this conversation with families and generous business owners, et cetera, is what's a principle that we can apply as we navigate what the potential answer for this might be. And the principle that we kind of espouse that's I think practical as you navigate this conversation is a principle we call steward, not owner. And again, maybe something that you've heard about before, but a verse that we think is impactful to that comes from Psalm 24:1, which simply says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." And if that's true, if everything truly does belong to God, and you entertain that worldview, then everything that we have is simply a resource that He provided. And if that's true, if we're just lucky enough, however you want to define that we get the resources we have agency over, whether that's our time, our talent, our treasure, whatever you want to say, then we are truly just a steward. We don't own it. So that maybe is a stepping stone to starting the conversation about how much is enough. It's just the recognition that we're not the owners of it. It doesn't belong to us, but we are the stewards of it. And if we're the stewards of His resources, how might He want us to think about that question? So, Jeff, I'll maybe kick it back to you. Any thoughts or comments on that commentary?
Yeah, I think you can take that off the screen and we can just kind of have a discussion so yeah, Cale, I thought we'd just sort of tell some stories. Maybe we're trying to talk about these top questions, give you a framework. And these three questions, these three primary questions we think as a steward that you have to ask the owner. If God's the owner and you're the stewards, you got to ask the owner what to do with it, right? And so this first question of how much is enough for you is a big deal. It's again not commonly asked, and we got a bunch of stories. You know what? One of the other biblical frameworks on this, I would say, is okay. Well, if God owns it all, what does He say in His Word
Mhm.
that we should do with it? And one of the most famous verses in on that, I would say, is First Timothy 6:17, and I'm just turning to it uh, real quick. First Timothy 6:17. All right, let me just read it to you, and then we'll talk about it maybe a little bit. Command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up for treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so they may take hold of the life that is truly life. What jumps out to you in that verse, Gail?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost is chances are, if you're tuning into this webinar, you are rich in this present age. What a blessing that is. For whatever reason, and I mean this as an encouragement to myself and all of us listening. For whatever reason, God entrusted you with some semblance of His resources, and you are rich in this present age. And so, as we all know, there's 1,000 Bible verses on how dangerous money can be. So again, in this verse, it's talking about not becoming arrogant or putting our hope in wealth. Well, that's what often sometimes can happen if we're not careful, is that becomes the source of our pride, the source of our significance. But it is so uncertain. It does not lead to joy, but to put your hope in God, who provides richly everything for our enjoyment. So that's the first part that jumps out at me. The second part that jumps out at me is command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and be generous and willing to share. Well, that's we get lots of examples of that, even just through Jesus's ministry and how He is rich towards others, in the way that He acts, the way that He talks, the way that he stewards His time, quite frankly. So how do we then, as stewards of His resources, be generous and willing to share with others and keep an open hand rather than a closed fist? The third part comes from that last verse, which is, what are we really building towards? Are we building up there's other great verse in Luke 12 we could talk about, the rich fool who builds up the storehouses for themselves or the bigger barns, but this is talking about laying up a treasure in heaven. What I think is very interesting, the thing that jumps out at me the most is the last part of verse 19, so that they may take hold of life, which is truly life. Life, which is truly life. Reminds me of another verse. Jesus says this in John 10:10, that He's come to give life and life abundant. So clearly we've got this connection between generosity and joy, and generosity and being rich in good deeds, that it's in doing this activity, we take hold of this life that is truly life, and we also store up for ourselves a treasure that will not fade away. So those are the, I guess, initial reactions to that verse. It's such a powerful one. It's a good pick here.
Yeah, it's kind of humility, putting your hope in God, doing good deeds. And then I think, Randy Alcorn's, I mean, I think his genius in writing the treasure principle and all the books he's written on this topic is this laying up of treasures. It took me a lot of years as a believer to really process that idea. And I think Randy's genius is highlighting that passage where I think for me, what I always think of when I think of Randy's writing is his line that you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead.
Mm.
So that's such a interesting concept of kind of the law of rewards.
Yeah.
So it's like, we've got to have this pure heart to help people because, God has been generous to us, but he's also fair, and by doing so, you know, you'll make sacrifices on this side of heaven, but he's going to reward you later. I don't think that's taught that much. I mean, did you hear that growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hear it growing up, but it's definitely not. It's almost like it's a little bit of a throwaway line, like
Yeah,
at
yeah.
least in
Like, what
my
does it actually mean to really like soak in that? Like,
yeah,
what?
to soak in that, and I think to really like consider if that's true, what does that mean for me today? I think it's kind of this idea, like, yeah, just do
Right.
nice things, and you'll be rewarded later. And it's kind of hard to put your mind there, sometimes when you just got, okay, well, anyways, back to work, right? But to really soak in it, sit in it, and process, like, if that's true, how do I orient my life today to maximize the opportunity that God's placed in my life to both take hold of an abundant life today, but also laying up for myself treasures in heaven that will not fade away. The other thing I thought of as you were talking, Jeff, and I'm sorry, I was looking down because I was trying to get to navigate to the verse myself, is a verse from Revelation 14. And kind of to your point about Randy Alcorn, his line on, you can't take it with you, but you can send it ahead. This verse from Revelation that's always sat with me. It's from chapter 14, verse 13, and it says, and it's talking about those of us that are believers, that die in the Lord. When we die, what happens? And it says, write this down. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. And it's in the response from the Spirit of God says, blessed indeed, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them, right? Their deeds follow them. So into his kingdom, we get to bring these things that we were able to participate while we were on this earthly plane. We get to also take those with us into that coming kingdom, which is a real amazing thing when you just stop to think about it. So maybe that's a good place to you know adjust the conversation a little bit, because I know we've got some examples and some stories, people we've met over the years that have navigated this question in unique and different ways. So maybe Jeff, you could share one of those stories as a starting point.
Well, the one we usually tell is the Alan Barnhart story. And some of the folks listening to this may have heard of him. He helped us start this podcast and is very involved with Generous Business Owner. We call it GBO, platform under which we're recording this. And, Alan's got this really unique story. You can go back and listen to the podcast, one of the very first podcasts we did, where we interviewed him and he told his story about coming out of college. you know, uh, he wanted to take over this small family business with his brother, a couple of cranes, and rent them out. And his wife wanted to enter the mission field, and their compromise was they would take over the family business, but set their salaries at what the mission board would pay them, and then give away everything over that. And that first year, they gave away $50,000. He thought that was amazing, and now it's tens of millions of dollars, and they've been on that journey for 40 years. It's really an amazing story, and I got good news for you. It's true, and Alan is as humble as they get. So it's really an amazing story. But sometimes when we tell that story, it's so radical,
Mm-hmm.
and most people that are hearing that story are mid-career or later in their career, and that ship has sailed in terms of paying themselves 100 grand or less a year. And so it's hard to relate to maybe, and not everybody's called to that either. But I think for me, even as we were talking about this sort of sending it ahead thing, I think when I read that before and I sort of, like you said, kind of blew past it a little bit, it's like, the little that I give will be multiplied. Oh, isn't that nice? Kind of cute. But when you start thinking about this idea of not how much should I give back to God, it's almost like even the tithe. Most people don't tithe at 10%, but um, even when I was given a couple of percent, okay, I thought, oh well, isn't that nice? That'll be multiplied. Maybe I'll get something nice, later.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think I always really, but really, I think my worldview was immature, where I really didn't. I thought of myself as the owner, and God, okay, He blessed me with the ability to do this, but anyway, it felt like I was giving it, as opposed to I'm receiving. And instead of asking what should I give, I asked myself, what am I allowed to keep?
Mm.
And so in like Alan's case, I feel like he's like, well, I mean, it's always been God's business, and he got this much earlier in life than I did, and they set it up early, and they set that
Yeah.
finish line super early, and they've had the blessing, like you were talking about, of this sort of thriving business and marriage for a long period of time, because God didn't maybe have to swing a baseball bat at their head later, as an adjustment, and so. But it's not always like that. Like we like to, as soon as I tell this Barnhart story, I always like to tell other stories. And
Yeah.
another podcast guest we had on is Tim Sidema, and you should go back and listen to that one. He's a real estate developer in Charlotte, and you know, he confessed he's got a big balance sheet, but and he sort of felt guilty about it or whatever. And then as he was telling the story, it sort of struck me that well, he needs a big balance sheet because the ministry he's doing is building low income housing for people, and it's not that profitable the way he does it. So not that many people want to invest in a low profitability project. So he needs the balance sheet to fund it. And so kind of what we got into is uh, this idea that we kind of call the tale of two barns, right? Like you referenced Luke 12, right? That's the story, the parable of the rich fool. Let me read just a little bit of that. Uh, the ground of a certain rich man. This is verses, let's see, 16 to 21. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich toward God. Themselves, right? So, and then
Mhm.
that contrast, right, with Genesis 41, verses 49 to 52, where I won't read it, but this is where Joseph, right,
Yeah.
builds bigger barns because there's a famine coming. God tells him. So it's not about the barn. It's
Yeah.
about what God tells you to do. It's okay to have a big balance sheet. It's just under what goal? And the goal is never just to sit back and relax. I mean, how do you unpack that for us a little, Cale?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that came to mind as you were talking is, and it kind of goes back to even the Kingdom versus World estate plan we were just running through. Is there's I think the world's way of generosity, particularly when it comes to the estate plan, as we like to say sometimes, involves this idea of if I'm nice and I feel like it, I'll tip the church or tip whatever charitable cause might be the case. And I think largely speaking, a lot of the let's call it just mainstream advice that's out there would say if you do that, you're being a great person. And I don't want to discredit anyone that's being generous in that way, but it is radical to maybe reorient in kind of the way you were describing it, Jeff, which is, if kind of it's a blessing that we get to keep any of it. And so how do
Right.
we start to, out of that proper orientation, think about what we're participating in? And I think where this really gets to is, and I know we talk a lot about this in Arcos, is what is the purpose?
Right.
What is the purpose for you, for your family, and ultimately for the resources that you've been blessed to steward, unto what end? And I think when you can start, and by the way, that's a hard question, I think, for anyone to answer. And I don't know if there's a one size fits all, like perfect purpose statement. It might adapt or change over time, and we've seen that. But I think when you work towards that, it starts to provide a North Star to start orienting around it. And I think that's a really, at least in my life, been a healthy thing. And maybe that's a good way to get a little practical. Like, what's a way to start? If you're sitting there, I'm glad you said it too about Alan, because I mean, he is probably the most radical story of generosity I've ever heard. And for those that are listening, tuning in, maybe that you've ever heard as well. Um, and the great thing about Alan is, Jeff, you said, is like he doesn't try to advocate for anyone else to do exactly what he did. I think if he advocates for anything, I think he would say, you should listen to what God's telling you and do whatever he says. So he likes to say he's just doing what God told him to do. But I think, even looking back across, um, stories from the Bible, you've got a lot of, let's call it the pillars of faith, especially from the Old Testament. If you look at them, a lot of them had significant means. So I think, sometimes in the church we tend to feel guilty if we have means, like, maybe something's wrong with us, or maybe we're just supposed to make more money and give it to the church, and that's kind of our lot in life. I think there's some bad ways we can view that, because wealth in and of itself is not a bad thing, but I think what's often talked about is how it's stewarded and for what purpose. So there's plenty of people throughout the history of the Bible that had significant means that were used in significant ways by God. And so I think that's the question: is how can I be used by God? Like, how can He leverage the resources I have? So maybe starting small as a practical step. I think one of the first places to start is just taking inventory of what you have, quite frankly, the resources that are yours to steward. And that's a broad term. I mean, we can take inventory even of the talents that we have, but even specifically just to money. What are the actual resources, like dollars and cents or assets, that I have to steward? What's the reality of today? And you'd be surprised. I think a lot of families, at least that we interact with in this generous business owner community, usually one person has an idea, a decent idea. They've got a number or a general kind of idea of where all the different resources are. But I would argue, one of the most common requests we get, Jeff, is helping people, like people that have a desire. Help me get organized. Help me even just take inventory on what I have, what's out there.
Okay. I think that's a really good point. Is as you're telling that, I have these meetings running through my
Mm,
brain where we have these meetings, and a lot of times, maybe half the time it's with somebody selling a company. Okay, and there's nothing wrong. Again, by the way, you know, I'm trying to run a company here at Arcos that lasts 100 years. Not everybody's got that vision, and that's okay. If God tells you to run the company for 100 years, you do that. If he tells you to sell it, you sell it. I mean, it's actually not about keeping it or selling it either. It's about obedience to whatever he calls you to do. And I think this doing the math. So I'm picturing these people come in, especially after they sell their business, and they're just sort of usually pulling just enough money out of the business to kind of live whatever lifestyle they're kind of used to, and so they don't even know what their financial finish line. They just haven't done the math. They don't even know
sure.
exactly what they're spending, and then we just encourage them to pray about, is that the right number? You want to keep living at that number, okay? And then we just do the math on endowing what that number looks like, and now you kind of have that financial finish line built. And
Yeah.
and, and I think we've told these sort of biblical stories and other stories, but we didn't say it overtly. But just to say it overtly, I mean, there's nothing in God's word that says, here's the lifestyle that's appropriate for everyone,
Yeah.
adjust by inflation since, you know, 2000 AD. You know what I
Well,
mean?
something you just said, I think it's worth camping out on because it's easy for us, I think, sometimes to blow past it because we live in this world every day. But you talked about kind of endowing a lifestyle. Will you unpack that? Because not everyone knows what that means. And that might even be for some people just a way to start, once you take inventory, just to say, okay, how do I endow where I'm at? What would that look like? Yeah.
Yeah, so like a simple, there's a million calculators. You can Google this and come up with all kinds of formulas. I'll give you a very conservative one. When I say endowment, I think about an endowment like a college endowment. Okay, and let's most college endowments or nonprofit endowments. Basically, if you've ever been on one of these boards, all of these have a document that has a spending policy in it, and that spending policy is usually about 5% of the total corpus of the endowment. Now, what's unique about endowments is they're not people; they can live longer than we can as humans.
Yeah.
So that spending, they usually like the corpus going up. So let's say they're trying to make 8% a year. If they spend five, and there's an extra 3% for inflation every year, but you could have a higher spending number as a human if you want to work that number down, if you don't need to leave the whole pile. So maybe that spending number is 6 or 7% for you. But if we just use that five as an example,
Yeah.
and if you're just easy math, if you need $1 million of income a year, and you're going to take 5%, well, you know, 5 times 20 is is maybe the number you need. Okay, or a million times, the 5% times 20 is 100%. So if 20 million at 5% would be $1 million a year. Okay, well, maybe you got 100 million bucks. What are you gonna do with the other 80? We'll get into that in future weeks.
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll talk about what the kids might need and so forth, what you leave behind. But I think that's just the easy math, kind of on kind of the endowment model, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to get started. And this speaks to
Yeah.
another principle we have at Arcos called have a written plan. Well, it's hard to have a written plan if you don't know, where everything is and have some semblance of what we're marching towards, and even the things that are marching towards that are less purpose oriented, but even something like, well, I think we might want to do X, Y, or Z. I always say, as a starting place, it's helpful maybe uh, to go a little crazy, especially if it's post liquidity event, to your point, where what do you think are the things you might want to do? Whether or not you do them, we don't know yet. But maybe you do want to purchase that second home or that, new toy or whatever it is. Um, that can start to build, you can start actually, we can do some math on that and start to back in kind of via an endowment model, to your point, a number. Say, okay, well, that's 20, 30, $40 million. Well, you got 100, right? We've got margin for all the things that you're saying you want to do. And I think that enables a conversation about a place to maybe start. So anything you would add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think, man, one of our jokes at the company is, if you've seen one generous business owner,
Yeah.
you've seen one generous business owner. In other words, God knows us so uniquely. I mean, I think that's a key point. I think you're giving super practical advice on where to start. And, if you're later in life and you're praying about these things, um, that process is a little bit different. But I just want to share another story for maybe the younger people listening to this. Maybe they're earlier in their careers, and I literally just finished today recording a podcast with Gary Ringer. So if you haven't seen that one, go back and look at that one. And Gary told this amazing story. He had a food business, and one was going really well, the sort of feed business that he inherited from his father, worked on with his father. The other one, he had kind of started it with a separate partner, and it was struggling. It was more of a food business, human food business. And he just was at the end of his rope, and he wrote a contract. His dad was actually an investor in that business too, but and he and his dad signed this contract that said, essentially, God, if you get us out of this mess and we get profitable, we'll just pay ourselves back for the money we put into it plus 8%. It was very specific, which I thought was very interesting
Yeah.
to your written plan deal, like,
Yeah.
and anything over that, we'll give it away. So what
Yeah.
does God do? In his sovereignty, of course, he didn't have to. I'm sure, he turned it around. It wasn't easy, lots of setbacks, but they ended up having a big exit. And his dad, and when he was exiting, he goes, "Hey, Dad, remember the contract?" And his dad's like, "Oh yeah, I know you signed that, but anyway, I'll take my half. You take your part, and you can do that God thing." He goes, "No, Dad, your signature's on here." He goes, "Really? Oh man." Anyway, and to Dad's credit, he abided by the contract. But Gary's point, and I know Alan Barnhart feels the same way. Gary ended up writing a book about this. Let me get the title for you: Radical Business. Okay, from ownership to stewardship. Okay, and he kind of told that story in there. And he's huge on this written plan thing. He's like, write down this finish line. Like, don't just talk about it. Like, write it down. Heck, maybe even you and your spouse sign it. Like, I think making, like, it might sound corny, but I think something about documenting it
Yeah.
and telling other people, maybe your advisors or family members or company people or whomever, have a little, accountability. Because even Alan Barnhart said there are plenty of times he was tempted. And
Yeah.
if he hadn't
Yeah.
told everybody, he probably wouldn't have done it. I love the honesty
Yeah.
of that. And I also love it when Catherine, his wife's, they're doing this interview and he's like, "We haven't missed out on any of the good stuff," says Alan. And Catherine's like, "Well, we missed out on some of the good stuff." I mean,
The honesty.
it's not going to be easy,
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
So I think writing it down, if you're younger, writing it down, and we know God tends to show up big time. Maybe not monetarily, but
Yeah.
he definitely shows up when you commit to him. And Gary's big thing was like he wished he would walked with the Lord more closely earlier. And his whole thing was like about intimacy. Like he likes to get in his hot tub and pray the Lord's Prayer and break down the pieces of it.
Yeah.
And like he's got this really cool intimacy that came after he wrote the plan.
Mm.
So like there's something about the commitment of
Yeah.
writing it down and then sticking to it. And Gary would tell you it brings a greater intimacy, which is
Yes.
really the
I
juice,
love
right?
that.
That's the
I love
thriving.
that. Yeah. That's the thrive.
That's actually the juice. And then he might give you the success, which is for other people anyway. But you
Yeah.
get the joy of participating in what he's doing. It's really an upside down way of looking at it
Well,
than the
that's
world
how it
looks at it.
always is. God's economy is always the reverse of what we think it is. But maybe that's a good thing to kind of press into real quick is and maybe we can share one or two more stories and then we'll go to Q&A, which is everyone we talk to that has been on this path of in their own way trying to respond to this idea of being a steward, not an owner, and trying to make uh, progressive progress, for lack of better words, if you'll excuse the bad grammar there, but progressive progress on how they can be more effective stewards and leverage the resources that they have agency over to expand the kingdom. I've never met one that's not, as they would tell you, living a fuller life. Now,
Yep.
how they define a fuller life might be different than how each of us uniquely define a fuller life, but they're all in a better place as a result of pressing into that. And so maybe just to land the plane on a couple practical tips of how to start, and maybe one or two more stories, and then
Well,
we'll.
that's how we generally wrap up the podcast. So we'll kind of do it that way. And anyway, so what are the practical tips?
Yeah, so I think one we already shared, which is take inventory,
Yeah, that's
right?
good.
Kind of what do I have to steward? And the second one we talked about a little bit, which is, well, what's the purpose? What are we marching towards? What's the legacy we're hoping to create? And if we have agency over these dollars or these assets, how do we want to steward these unto that purpose? And then the last part with that would be, if you don't know where to start, maybe you just start small. We've got another person that's been on the podcast before, Jeff, that likes to talk about starting in miniature. I think that's a good, healthy way to, if you're not sure, if it seems a little overwhelming to you, start small. Maybe just, it could be something as simple as okay, we're not going to spend more than we did last year. You know, you don't necessarily have to go way backwards, or we're only going to increase by X%. It could, by the way, you can always adjust over time. So I think starting small, and then you already alluded to this, Jeff, which is having that community and some sort of accountability along the way, I think is so rewarding. And as you journey into this, we like to say act, learn, adjust. Like start small, so take the action. You're going to learn. You can always adjust. So I think that's maybe how I'd wrap up some practical tips. Take inventory, which will give you margin, by the way, to actually start thinking about, well, what is the purpose? Because that's not you don't just have one conversation with your spouse and ding, 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 you got it. Maybe, but unlikely. Most people we talk to, that could be years long to march into that and trying things. But taking inventory, which will give you margin to kind of define that, and starting small and acting, learning, adjusting, having some community accountability about you. I think that's a great place to start. And as another example of how this comes to fruition, a few weeks ago, Jeff, we were all at the Greens in Oklahoma City. The Greens, of course, famously, founded Hobby Lobby. They've done so many things, but as they navigated this, their own pursuit of trying to be stewards, not owners, and defining, what's the how much is enough for us. By the way, journey for them. But something that's come out the other side of this is, as they've gotten clearer on what that purpose is, they've been able to do some amazing things in the kingdom and also with their family. Everything from, funding the Museum of the Bible, which we've probably all heard of, the Bible app that's on your phone. They've done so much in Bible translation. That only comes from that pursuit to try to connect wealth and resources with purpose. The other one, I was just in DC with a bunch of the guys that have funded some of the different new Christian media that's been coming out. Most recently, if you go to Amazon Prime right now, you'll see House of David's like #1. And it's really cool to see people that have kind of asked themselves these questions, started to reorient how they're leveraging the resources God has given them to promote, even in mainstream media, let's just say, change kind of the messaging out there in what's accessible on TV or streaming platforms. So there's a lot of cool ways in that this can take shape. It doesn't just have to look like Alan. It doesn't just have to look like the Green family or anyone else. There's a lot of different people out there, hence the podcast, Jeff, that are navigating what it looks like to steward their resources in meaningful ways. So as you said, there's not a one size fits all way to do this, but there is the opportunity and maybe the challenge to start. So how would you
I
wrap
think
that
we're up
up?
against the time, Cale.
Yeah.
So let's wrap it up. But did you say you have any questions from the audience, real quick? And
Yeah,
if
so
not,
just a couple
we'll
questions. Let me
sign off.
navigate real quick to the Q&A that came in. Here we go. All right, so first question. Let's do this one first because it'll be easy. Someone asked if we could reference the First Timothy verse again. Do you mind sharing that reference?
Sure. That First Timothy verse, First Timothy 6, starting at verse 17. That's really where that is.
17 through 19.
Yeah,
That
17
chapter.
to 19. Yeah.
Okay, so First Timothy 6, 17 to 19. That was an easy one. All right, here's a little bit harder one. This is a good one. How do I unwind my plan if I'm already in the world's template?
Yeah.
That's one we get asked quite a bit. I'll let you start.
Well, sometimes it's hard. I mean, in the Greens case, David Green, who started Hobby Lobby, he did even what the Christian estate planning people did, and just divided by the number of kids and grandkids. And then he signed everything, created irrevocable trust, and sat there on a Saturday morning. And God said, I own the tree, and you're supposed to eat only the fruit. And you gave away the tree. And David said he started weeping and had to call a family meeting and have everybody sign a form to revoke their um, rights to that cash flow. And of course, we always sort of joke, kind of half jokingly, that one of the reasons that they gave it back was they're all aligned spiritually. That's the big reason. But the second reason is the money hadn't started flowing yet. So once the money starts flowing, so if it hasn't, you can maybe get it back. If it has, it's tougher. And we have plenty of cases in our business where that is already happening. And the key then is to prepare the stewards well, because it is irrevocable and they're getting the money or they're going to get the money. And let's do the best we can to prepare them. So just because they have a lot of money early in their lives does not mean they will be ruined.
Mm.
It's only if they're not running the right software. So it's a risk factor to having difficult things happen in your life. Isn't that ironic? People think money will solve your problems. As people who have money realize, it creates more. And reminds me of the old joke. Everybody knows money can't buy happiness, but everybody wants to find out for themselves. So anyway, just teaching these principles. And sometimes things are revocable. So you really just got to take a hard look, kind of like what you said is, don't just assume nothing can be done. Take a hard look at what's
Mm.
been done. And sometimes things are able to be changed. How would you jump off of that, Cale?
I think you summarized it really well. The only thing I would add, just to connect the dots too, if for the people listening that maybe haven't gone through the estate plan process yet, take time to navigate that, ideally with someone that's aligned that can walk you through it. But I think one thing we sometimes will advise people is, because it might take time to figure out what's that purpose and what do I want. You might not have the answer to the question, but for whatever reason, you still need to have something on paper. We like to say, don't let the tax tail wag the dog. A lot of times the estate planning process is so focused on mitigating taxes, which obviously we'd love to mitigate taxes, but if it's at the expense of something you're unsure about for your kids or legacy or purpose, I would argue that's the bigger risk. So maybe one practical takeaway with that is keep things revocable until you're certain you know what you want to happen.
Well, and I think to your point, I use the green example because that was already a profitable business, but a lot of times these things are set up and not funded early in life, and they are able to be changed. You can make them revocable, or they're not funded yet. You could shut them down or move things around. So there often is there are things you can do, but it's
Yeah.
a good question because most people have that kind
Yeah.
of estate, but a lot of times the money hadn't started flowing yet, so there's still hope if that
Yeah.
hadn't happened. So
Well,
anything else, or should we wrap it?
let's do one more question because we got 9 minutes until we're officially done. But so we'll do one more question and then we'll wrap it up. So, and this is a good one. What is one practical step my spouse and I can take this week as we try to set up our own financial finish line? What's one practical step we can take this week? I would say a couple different things. First, as it pertains specifically to the financial finish line question, back to that kind of earlier point, like start with just take inventory. Oftentimes spouses are not on the same page when it comes to where all the closets are of different assets. So taking inventory and doing that together is actually you'd be surprised how few people do that. So I would say that's a great way to start. Another exercise we have with clients that we do is what we call the wealth languages, which is trying to get on the same page on kind of your intrinsic motivation around money. Great next step, just to kind of have an easy entree conversation about how you uniquely think about money. Maybe talk about why that is as a couple. That's a great next step conversation. And the last thing I'll say, this isn't specific to financial finish line, but I think maybe is tangential, especially in the context of the estate, is we talk a lot about kind of the 5 capitals of a full inheritance. And when we think about estate planning, a lot of times we jump to the financial capital, the stuff, money and stuff we're going to leave behind. And a lot of our planning and brain power is spent unto that. But there's other things that we leave behind, things like, relational capital, the people that intellectual capital, which could be everything from education that, they go to college, or even just things that you teach them character capital, the virtues and values that you instill, and spiritual capital, right? Your faith and your wisdom that you pass on. And oftentimes we spend an overabundance of time on the financial capital, solving that, and perhaps an underabundance of time on the other capital. So one practical thing is maybe just to, as you're taking inventory of your balance sheet, so to speak, taking inventory of how are we investing in these capitals, and if we happen to have means, is there a way that we can reallocate some of those dollars to investment in these capitals that our kids or grandkids? Might be one exercise. Anything you would add there, Jeff?
I think that's a great overview.
All right. Well, then I think we hit the time, man. I'll
All
let you
right.
wrap it up.
Well, listen, I just thanks, Cale, for being part of this conversation. I know we've been in a lot of these together and separately, and so this is the first question we asked. And so just to kind of reframe our conversation today, this is a series on kind of kingdom versus world estate planning and the three critical questions you've got to ask as a steward to the owner, which of course is God, to kind of get to an estate plan that he would have guided as opposed to a template that the world would guide. So remember, those three questions are: how much is enough for you? How much is enough for the kids? And what do you do with the rest? We did number one, and we'll do how much enough for the kids, essentially, in our next one. So stay tuned. Thanks, everybody, for joining us on this week's Generous Business Owner Podcast. Share it with a friend, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.